Hi, friends. Father Kerry Walters here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one on coronavirus and God's will. The World Health Organization has now declared the coronavirus as a pandemic. It is in over 60 nations of the world. It is just as communicable as garden variety flu virus, but it is about 20 times more lethal than standard flu viruses. And that, of course, is cause for alarm. You and I are facing a worldwide biological epidemic. That's bad enough. But what makes it even worse is that if we're not really careful, we're likely to be infected by another kind of virus as well, a spiritual virus caused not by a biological virus, but by a meme virus that lodges in the mind, in the memory, and in the imagination. What am I talking about? There's been a lot of chatter recently online about the coronavirus being God's punishment upon a sinful world. It's God's will that the coronavirus be inflicted upon us because we have tolerated gay lifestyles in our midst, which, according to these doomsayers, are abominations in the eyes of God. This is a horrible thing to say, and it only exacerbates the panic and the fear and the anger that many people feel whenever they're confronted with a threat like a pandemic. It scapegoats. And scapegoating is always a prelude to some kind of psychological and physical and social and economic retribution, some kind of violence. People who say this are not only being unethical, they don't really understand what God's will is all about. And so I would like to spend just a few moments today reflecting with you about God's will. I can think of no better representative to invoke at this point than a man named Walter Ciszek. You may have heard of him, you may not have heard of him. Ciszek was a Jesuit priest who spent 23 years behind the Iron Curtain in Soviet Russia. But those 23 years weren't at all what he had intended when he went to the Soviet Union. Ciszek was raised in the coal country of Pennsylvania, and he came from an Eastern European background and had a great ambition to enter the Soviet Union, which was an officially atheistic state, clandestinely to serve as a priest to people who were hungry for God. He managed to get his way inside the Soviet Union in the late 1930s, but just a few years later, in 1941, his role, his identity was discovered by the authorities, and he was imprisoned. The first 5 years, he was in absolute solitary confinement in the infamous Lubyanka prison in Moscow, and the years after that, he served at hard labor in the Soviet gulag. He was finally repatriated back to the United States during John F. Kennedy's presidential administration. During his time in the gulag, Ciszek frequently fell into what can only be described as despair. He wondered what horrible, horrible sin he had committed that had led God to punish him in such a horrible way. He, in other words, believed that it was God's will that he was suffering as he was suffering. When he was released, he had more time to reflect upon his experiences. He wrote two really quite wonderful books about them. One, entitled With God in Russia, is more or less an autobiographical account of his years behind the Iron Curtain. But the second one, He Leadeth Me, is a spiritual reflection upon those years. And it's in that book that Ciszek says something that I think is quite wonderful about God's will. It's this. We oughtn't to think that whatever befalls us, be it imprisonment in a gulag or be it the coronavirus, is God's will. God is a God of love. God doesn't will that innocent people suffer. No, God's will is that you and I respond to whatever situation we find ourselves in a godly manner. Let me say that again. God's will isn't any particular situation that might befall us, but rather that we respond to any particular situation in which we find ourselves in a godly manner. You and I are made in the image of God, and what that means is that we are capable, aren't we, of acting in a way that is consonant with God's will. We are capable of acting with love and compassion and patience and wisdom. These qualities have been instilled in us from our very conception because we are made in the image of God. And when we are in any situation, regardless of whether the situation brings us joy or whether it brings us pain or whether it brings us something in between those two ends of the spectrum, we are called to exercise those qualities, to exercise those virtues. So in this pandemic that we find ourselves in, we're called to respond to others with love and compassion. We're called to work for their well-being as best we can. We're called to make ourselves available to them in order to help them in their distress. We're called to be patient with their suffering. We're called to be wise or prudent in the ways in which we help them. It may be the case that our way of making ourselves available to people in a pandemic is by necessity going to have to be different in the ways in which we make ourselves available to them in normal times. And I'm not just talking about, for example, withholding the chalice at Mass or having no physical contact in the passing of the peace. We may have to find creative ways outside of the church doors to make ourselves available to people who have been quarantined, or to make ourselves available when we ourselves are quarantined, all in the spirit of love and compassion and patience and wisdom. That's what we're called to do. That's what God's will is for us. God's will is not that we suffer, much less that a particular group of people suffer along with innocent people. No, God's will is that we comport ourselves according to the qualities that He has instilled in us. And the first and foremost of those qualities, of course, is love. In this season of Lent, you and I should be practicing those divine qualities embedded in us anyway. But this season of Lent, in which we find ourselves in a worldwide crisis, a crisis in which we are implicated in a biological epidemic, is one in which we want to avoid likewise implicating ourselves in a spiritual epidemic by allowing this meme of hatred and scapegoating and vituperation to enter into us and to poison our souls. My friends, we must keep in mind what St. Irenaeus said so many centuries ago, but which is still just as pertinent today as it was then. You and I, because we are made in the image of God, are capable of great, great things. And the glory of God is a human being who accomplishes those great things and hence becomes fully alive. In this time of worldwide distress, in this time in which fear and panic are so easily raised by a rash word or by an angry accusation, let us remember who we are. Let us remember that we are made in the image of a loving God and hence are called in whatever situation we find ourselves in to share that love with others. Let us avoid the spiritual pandemic even if we can't avoid the biological one. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. God bless each and every one of you.